Well, and I feel like everyone has the fraud complex when they're stepping into a brand new career, especially when we're green. But I think it's just...
Did you say frog?
Frog complex. When we're green.
Oh, I get the frog complex. I'm like,
I said fraud.
Bryan Piatt is a mental health therapist. Welcome to the crew.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Welcome to the tribe.
Honored.
Specializing in supporting people living with OCD and anxiety. He is a former news anchor and reporter at KARE 11.
And I thought, you know what, I have this platform. I don't want to waste it. And I ended up opening up and sharing my story and talking about mental health and the things that I'd gone through with, panic attacks and a lot of, more specifically with OCD. And that just launched this whole path that I've been on of advocacy work around mental health and eventually leaving my job at KARE 11 and becoming a therapist.
And I love this story because this is a lifelong process of staying well.
This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and guests. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. This podcast also does not establish a standard of care, doctor-patient, or client relationship. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. And because each person is so unique, all listeners are encouraged to connect with counseling and medical professionals for assistance with their personal journey. All people, places, and scenarios mentioned in the podcast have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved.
Welcome to We're Not Fine. I'm Dr. Talia Jackson.
And I'm Doug Jensen. We thank you for listening every week to our deep and thought-provoking conversations about relationships.
Nick also said that sometimes late at night he listens to our podcast and paints.
Yep.
So I think that's actually me.
It does look exactly like you.
I knew it, except the glasses. That's
And
it.
the running things at the bottom. What is that, Talia, exactly?
My leg hair dripping off my knees.
Well, I don't think anyone needed to hear that.
Oh, now we're going to introduce the podcast. We're Not Fine. Doug and I have known each other for 5,000 years. He hired me. He was the owner of the River City Clinic 20 years ago. I was pre-licensed. He took a chance on me. And then 20 years later, we're still besties. And we created this beautiful podcast to make conversations about mental health and relationships accessible to everyone, even if they have never set foot into a therapy office. And so we try to tackle all topics where mental health meets relationships.
I love that.
Well, good.
It sounds like a really good podcast. I do. I want to do a podcast with you. I want to say a couple things. First of all, very, very grateful for Nick Harper allowing us to use this studio. This feels like always the kind of magical place for us to have these dialogues. And it sets a tone for me that I think really works. Plus, I feel very welcome here. We have mutual admiration for Nick as he does us. I also look around this group, I will tell you, and it's just very touching to me for whatever role any of you have with us. I'm very grateful to know all of you. You're just amazing people, and I'm so glad you're a part of this. It's really meaningful. And after 29 years of practice, it's nice to see these faces still here. And of course, without further ado, as we have been talking for about an hour already.
We've already done a full podcast.
I feel like we've done the full. I was recording the whole thing.
You missed it.
And I'm the anxious manifestation of anxiety.
Looks great.
What?
It looks good.
Thank you, Bryan, for that affirmation.
Yeah.
So let me introduce Bryan, and I'm going to read this so I don't miss anything. Bryan Piatt is a mental health therapist. Welcome to the crew.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Welcome to the tribe.
Honored.
Specializing in supporting people living with OCD and anxiety. He is a former news anchor and reporter at KARE 11. So many people have observed that you were the sunrise guy and could not wait to meet you. So I'm glad you're here.
Well, thank you.
You've made your dent, which creates us. He also is the podcast host of Take What Serves, Leave the Rest podcast, which creates a safe space to talk about mental health. For the last 5 years?
3 to 5.
Okay.
We'll go with 5. Let's just say 5.
Yeah.
We're rounding up.
We're
we
rounding
could
up.
take
You are
the
so
average
experienced.
and do
29
4.
years
20,
doing your podcast.
42 years. That's incredible. In a long time.
You
look
were
good.
neonate when you
You look good
started.
as well. Okay, for the last 5 years, Bryan has been speaking. That's what the 5 years is. Been speaking publicly about his own journey with OCD and anxiety. He's also a breathwork facilitator, meditation guide, and yoga teacher. None of which I do.
No, but we have a few in the audience.
Okay.
We've got yoga teachers, breath workers. healing.
Woven throughout all of his work is the message that no matter what you're experiencing, you aren't alone. What a very nice sentiment. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
So glad you're here.
Honored to be here. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Hello.
Yay!
Good to be here.
It's really good to have you.
I have no idea what we're going to talk about.
We're going to surprise you.
All of this that we put together, that's none of what we're going to talk about.
We're going to test your geography trivia knowledge.
This is good.
Immediately.
As long as we don't do like calculus, I should be okay.
I don't think I ever took calculus.
I'm going to use a lot of pi today as a result of that.
3.14. That's about all I know, though.
Oh, that's really good.
159.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Wow.
Look at us.
I'm so impressed. Well, so Bryan is here to share his story of anxiety and OCD intensifying as he was working at KARE 11 on air, panic attacks, panic disorder, and it being pretty debilitating to the point where you decided that you needed to step back.
Yep.
And we're so glad that you're going to share that story. And anxiety, I mean, it affects 7 million people in the US. I swear it's probably doubled since COVID and the really intense political climate.
And given all that's going on globally, right?
Absolutely.
Like it's a global issue for sure.
And I don't know if people know as much about obsessive compulsive disorder and what that looks like, what it feels like, panic disorder.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah. And it's kind of become my life's work, I think, in many ways to have conversations about these things now at this point. I think you're spot on, particularly with OCD. A lot of misinformation out there and a lot of people who just don't really fully understand the magnitude of how it can impact somebody. And there's actually a lot of people out there living with OCD who don't know that that's what they're actually going through. And it was that way for me for a really long time. And so it's been an honor to be given a platform through my work at KARE 11. That was kind of the coolest thing I think about that job, was just the platform that it gave me to be able to sit here and have conversations like this with the two of you.
I appreciate that. And you said something about people don't oftentimes know it's OCD. I will say people don't know what anxiety is either.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of, I'm so anxious, or I'm panicking, or I had a panic attack, and it's not really what's happening. So part of our discussion today will be about getting rid of some of those myths about it and talking about the seriousness of what these symptoms are. Yeah. I think, Bryan, when you talk about not knowing, I remember I was working with a couple and it was very clear that one of the people had anxiety, and I commented right away and he said, I don't have anxiety. And I'm like, oh, fuck, yes, you do.
Sometimes you're the last to know.
Well, absolutely. And it really does invade their relationships. It invades their functioning on a day-to-day level.
Yeah.
And so it's really important to understand kind of what's going on, and people suffer through this.
Yeah. And I think people get really, really good at covering it up too. You know, I think that's one of the biggest things that I've become kind of this expert, I think, at projecting to the world this image of like, I'm good, when internally, as the people who are closest to me in my life know, that's not always the case. And so I think that's the thing too, is there's a lot of people walking around maneuvering things really, really tough internally, like anxiety or OCD or whatever it might be. And people just aren't seeing it. And so I think a lot of people don't realize there's more people struggling with this.
Right. It's really lonely. And shame makes things 1,000 times lonelier.
Absolutely.
But I mean, let's just dive in and everything will unfold. He's going to share more and more of his story. We're going to learn more and more about it. But it sounds like your anxiety started pretty early.
Yeah.
And even, I mean, in middle school. And that there was, I'm curious about how your OCD and anxiety started showing up. And it sounds like there was a pivotal moment for you.
Yeah. I look back at my childhood, and wonderful, beautiful childhood. Had a lot of, wonderful family. Grew up a very, very happy kid for the most part. I look back and I was always the kid I was always really scared of like tornadoes, or really, really scared about what if I throw up at school, or what if I randomly pass out at school, or like just there were things like that I found myself as a kid getting really kind of worked up about, that I didn't really, as a kid, I think kids worry about a whole bunch of things, but I would get really fixated on certain things like that. And I don't think really knew at the time, obviously as a kid, you're just like, okay, they're like, whatever, I'm just doing my thing as a kid. And then had this experience of, I grew up in Denver, Colorado. So I grew up in the beautiful Rocky Mountains of Colorado. And then my family moved me to basically the exact opposite of that, Fargo, North Dakota.
How is that different?
Yeah, just slight geographical change.
Of Rocky Mountains are like flat.
I heard some like woo-woos out there. We have some Fargo people?
Yeah.
Nice.
Go Fargo.
We'll talk, okay. So we made that move, and not long after that, I was sitting in the lunchroom at Agassiz Middle School in Fargo. Do you know Agassiz Middle School?
Wait, what, Erica? You know what high school he's talking? Middle school?
You went to Agassiz Middle School?
Yeah.
No way.
How old are you?
So I'm 38.
Yeah, I'm older than you.
Okay.
Only by a minute or two.
We'll talk later.
I'm sure there's some
I think
overlap.
I was a Caspian tiger. There were like different like groups. Did you have different groups when you were at Agassiz Middle School? This is turning into a whole podcast about schools in Fargo, basically.
Maybe by a decade.
Got it. Okay.
Don't think.
Any trauma we need to discuss from that experience?
So I'm sitting in the lunchroom, and I had this experience of getting totally overcome with this feeling of being really like detached from my body. All of a sudden it felt like I was like watching my life through, like, it was almost like I was there, but I wasn't there. It felt like I was watching like through a movie. Everything felt very unreal. I felt like I was in a dream, and just became terrified at this feeling that I was experiencing in the lunchroom. And I know I always kind of wonder like what the perception is when I share this, because and even when I say it, sometimes it's kind of like, like, it doesn't sound like maybe it's that scary, but like when you're a sixth grader and you've never heard anything talked about when it comes to like mental health,
Yep.
It totally rocked me to my core. And I can honestly say that from the bottom of my heart that my mental health has not been the same since that day.
How old were you at that time?
It was sixth grade, so I was about 12 years old.
Okay.
I think even for an adult, it would be terrifying. It's like losing control of your body or feeling like you're outside of your body.
Yeah, it was just this like really scary feeling of, I don't know what this feeling is. This feels really, really scary. But I didn't really know how to talk about it. I remember at that point, I became really like fixated on like every day I would literally wake up and be like mentally checking, like, is that feeling there? And what we know about feelings like this is that the more that you check for them, right, the more that they're showing up. And so, yeah, I mean, that kind of just like launched this whole sequence of events of getting really focused on, maybe I have a brain tumor, or maybe I'm losing my mind and going crazy, or, there's just something wrong with me. I don't really know quite what it is, but it feels really scary and I don't really know how to talk about it. And so I'm just going to like internalize it and just try to keep doing my best, and mental health it wasn't talked about as much.
Did you talk to anyone about it?
I did. I did my best to try to communicate things like to my parents. And my parents did the best that they could in that moment. I think I was describing to them, like, I was describing that my heart was really, really beating really fast in my chest.
Yep.
And so like they took me into the doctor and, talked about things with the doctor. And I think they kind of like checked me out and were like, hey, everything seems normal. But mental health wasn't really like flagged at that age for me. And so, I look back and I'm like, man, that would have been really nice at that age to have somebody give me kind of the verbiage of, hey, there's this stuff called anxiety. And I would later learn the term like depersonalization and derealization, which are very common terms for that feeling that I was describing. But it just never, I didn't know what it was.
So Bryan, I want to jump on a couple things you said. I'm somewhat curious about, like, you wake up every day after that, kind of worried that the same thing will happen.
Totally.
What a dread. I mean, it kind of exacerbates then that anticipatory experience, right?
Totally. And it became, I mean, I have a lot of memories as a kid of like Christmases and being like, Christmas is like the best day ever as a kid, and being like, oh, I just really don't want that feeling to be there on Christmas. And I remember of course, because I didn't want it to be there, it would get even worse on Christmas, and I would have to like kind of maneuver that.
Yep. Getting anxious about being anxious.
Yeah, it was just this really tough cycle that I was in that I continued to function. You know, I really do think from the outside looking in, it didn't really look like there was anything going on with me. You know, I did fine in school. I was, if you can believe it, I was on the football team
I do believe
in
it.
high school,
Well,
which
guess
was
what, Bryan?
the worst sport choice
So
for me.
was I.
But you were on the football team?
That's right.
It's called
I feel
powder
like,
puff.
Leslie, I heard my best friend since the age of 13 fly in here under the radar, squeaking across the room somewhere. But she can vouch for me. I was on the football team with the guys.
What? Really?
Don't ask me what position.
I was just going to ask you what position you played.
I don't even know. I don't even know what position I was in. But there are pictures.
Yeah, I would love to see those
8th grade.
pictures.
It was
Yeah.
also the worst experience.
We
of my
should have
life.
been on the same team
I
because we could
agree.
have really kept each other
I agree. And people were
safe.
too
We could have kept each
scared
other
to
create a
safe.
tackle
team.
me. They
Yeah.
like didn't know what to do with me. And they were like, who let you on this team? But when you're in a small private school and there's no girls football, and
I love that though.
I just thought maybe I'd meet a cute guy.
Yeah.
Is that what you were hoping for?
Subconsciously,
both
yes.
hoping
Probably. I don't think I fully understood what was happening in that department of my life yet, but
So go back to this. So you played football. Keep going.
played football, and yeah, I mean, I went to college. I mean, I don't know if I'm kind of getting ahead of ourselves here a little
No,
bit,
you're
but
perfect. The next question was take us through high school, college.
yeah, went to high school.
Starting to date, everything.
Went to college, went to school at St. Cloud State University, go Huskies, and started studying broadcast journalism. And I, you know, I always kind of felt like, I never really felt like I had a place where I necessarily like belonged until I found the campus TV station at St. Cloud State and my friends and everybody that I worked with there at UTVS. And it became finally this thing where I really enjoyed doing it. I had a really beautiful like community of people around me. And, you know, it launched me into this career working in broadcast journalism, which I've kind of been on ever since.
So you'll notice that I can't let go of some things and I'm going way off script. I want to jump back to 6th grade. So first of all,
You
I'm
must
curious.
be a therapist.
I'm thinking about it.
Just
I'm giving it some thought.
lingering.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm struck by is, do you recognize now what that was? Because it sure sounds like some panic emerging.
Yeah. I think it was
Heart palpitations.
big time. I think I mean, there's a lot of different ways that I look at it. I think
That's what I want to know.
one of the ways to look at it is I think my system at that age, I was getting bullied a little bit at that age too. And I think my system didn't really, it was just like too much for my system to handle.
Yeah.
I think in many ways.
That's fair.
And I also think I've also learned as I've later in life got diagnosed with OCD. And as later learned, that can be a very common thing of like kind of this hyper, like mentally checking all the time for a certain feeling, kind of the obsessiveness around that.
Yeah.
So I think there was probably a whole combination of things going on, but I think it was really at a young age when that stuff just really got activated for me in a big way.
So, and of course, with obsessions or intrusive thoughts, they can turn into compulsions as well. Did you find yourself coping or strategizing every day to get through the day?
Yeah, well, I think the compulsion to look at it through that lens was just the constant mental, like I just keep coming back to that, like mental checking. And it's this thing that I still to this day struggle with big time. It's like this always mentally, internally, like, okay, is that feeling there? What does that feeling mean? And that might mean this. And like, you're just living so much up in your head all the time, instead of like just being able to like be in the moment and be present
and experience things through your eyes and not picturing maybe how other people are experiencing you or I mean I don't know if would you feel comfortable talking a little bit about obsessive compulsive disorder?
sure.
And
so how I like to describe it is every single person on the planet experiences intrusive thoughts. Like everybody in this room, everybody listening to this podcast experiences a whole range of thoughts every single day. Some of the thoughts that we experience, we might be a little bit embarrassed to admit that that's going on in our brain. Somebody who does not struggle with OCD is generally going to like have that thought come up, and it's like, oh, that's kind of an interesting thought, or that's an interesting feeling. And then it just is kind of like, I'm going to kind of move on with my day. Like I don't spend a lot of time focused on it. Whereas somebody living with OCD, instead of, oh, I'm just going to move on with my day, it's like, oh, what's that thought? Why did I have that thought? What does that thought mean about me? Or what does that feeling mean? And you just spend hours and days and weeks and years like ruminating and getting really, really, really fixated and doing a lot of things to try to get distress to go away or get things figured out mentally. So that's kind of how I like to describe it.
Beautiful. And so like the obsessive part, and then how do the compulsions start to kick in with the obsessive thoughts?
Yeah. So what was the big game changer for me was, a lot of people and kind of what the media, what the world has presented as far as what OCD is, are more physical compulsions. So we think of more, I have an intrusive thought that what if I have, certain germs on my hands? Well, I'm going to go do this compulsion of washing my hands repeatedly to try to achieve 100% certainty that I don't have germs on my hand. Yep. So those would be more like physical compulsions. And there's so many different ways that can take shape. There's also this kind of a way that people refer to the manifestation of OCD, where compulsions, instead of them being physical, they're mental. So they're things that that people are doing in their brain that nobody ever sees to try to figure out, get to the bottom of, eliminate discomfort, whatever it is around certain thoughts that you're having. Yep. And so pure OCD is what that's often described as. And when I learned about that was just like a total game changer for me, because I was like, that explains a lot of what's going on for me, because I wasn't fitting the mold of like this kind of quote unquote stereotypical presentation of what OCD is.
Yeah. The movie As Good as It Gets, where Jack Nicholson, I think, has to count steps. And if he doesn't get to and I had a client who, if there wasn't the right amount of steps to my office from the front door, they had to go back and do it. Right. Totally. But contamination and perfectionism and the fear of hurting self or others are the three main ways. And you mentioned the contamination piece. Yeah. And that's what a lot of people think about. Go ahead.
And there's a lot of, I think that people don't realize is that for some people who struggle with OCD, the thoughts that latch are there can be like these like taboo themes that latch for people. So things around sex or harm or, a whole range of things that would be like the last thing that you would really want to talk about with somebody are what stick for people. So I work with clients. I've experienced it myself, like having these thoughts of, what if I, you have this random thought come up, like, what if I hurt somebody? And then somebody without OCD can have a thought like that and kind of move on with their day. Whereas with OCD, you're like latched into this cycle of, oh my God, I had this thought. What does that mean? Am I a dangerous person? And that's where the shame really starts to kick in.
Well, and if like you hit a bump while you're driving. Yeah. People with OCD will think, did I hit somebody? Was that a person? Did I kill somebody? And they'll watch the news, right?
For sure.
Make sure that for the next few days that doesn't happen.
For sure.
Bryan, I have so many things I want to ask you. I want to go back a little bit because you talk about sixth grade and kind of what that age group is. And I do wonder, and I keep going back to it. I wonder about hormones. I wonder about, and happy Pride, everybody. But there's two gay people on this panel, myself and you, and happy Pride to you.
Happy Pride to you.
Thank you. I'm somewhat curious if being gay and feeling different had a piece of that process for you.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't
knowing.
And I don't think I know the answer to that. What I do know is that I am a highly sensitive person who was in sixth grade and was probably feeling a lot of pressure to be a certain way of what a guy is supposed to be team. And, like all this stuff that, being a young, sensitive boy who doesn't necessarily fit the mold of like what it means to be a quote unquote man. Right. I'm sure that was playing a factor at that time.
Just feeling different and feeling like people might see you differently, or, when you talk, and I'm very curious about that. When we're having those symptoms, I can't even imagine in sixth grade, not wondering if people could see what you were feeling. Yeah. Like just that panic going on and trying to pretend that it's not happening.
Yeah, it was brutal. And it's, And it's amazing how even like to this day, right? Like that stuff still continues to carry forward. Harry, I'm trying to like pull us out of that again. You're going to probably pull me back.
I'm going to keep pulling you back.
Sixth grade.
into that.
Back to sixth grade.
I should be a therapist.
You should.
You have a lot of potential in that field, I think.
Oriented.
For noticing. So back to sixth grade.
So back to sixth grade. But what I was going to say is it's interesting how, you know, as much like work as I try to do in myself and as I've gone on this whole journey of life, it's that foundational thing is still there of how good I am at hiding how I'm really feeling.
Right.
You know, like it got so imprinted in me, I think at a really young age.
Like with the bullying and you're having this really disturbing internal experience, and it's like the bigger the chasm right between what you're experiencing internally and what you're able to share with others, because it wasn't particularly safe. Or that people weren't emotionally intelligent in this middle school. Even nothing wrong with the middle school, just middle school in general.
So you hate Fargo.
Yes, that's okay.
A gassy
You're
middle
really
school.
against Fargo, not a Fargo person over
I'm
here.
really curious about the older you got. Doug can bring us back to sixth grade in a little bit, but the older you got, so like high school, and finding this career in TV, and just feeling like you had to be more and more public facing while battling internally. What was that like for you? How was your mental health?
I don't know how much truth there is to this. There's probably a nugget in there of truth that it's interesting that I picked a career that's extremely public facing and is extremely like, I'm going to be a broadcaster. You know, I often wonder how much of that was me like really overcompensating for kind of this deeper feeling of insecurity. Like I'm going to go do something that looks really cool and is like really flashy and that I'll get all this like external praise for.
It's the opposite of living with anxiety.
Yeah.
Like no one would ever know.
But it's also, you have a role and you have a persona and you have a job to do.
Yeah. And I felt, and I really did. Yeah. And I felt like truly when I got into college and started doing TV, it was just this thing that it felt natural to me. It felt like, oh, there's this like whole community of people that I get to do this with. I really enjoy doing this. I was actually really interested in sports initially. And then it's kind of funny how I look back on it and I kind of beat myself up about this for a little bit, but when I came out as gay, I remember telling myself, okay, you can't be gay and also be a sports reporter at the same time, because you're gonna have to go in the locker rooms and they like won't let you in the locker room. Like there was just stuff like that happening internally. So I pivoted away from sports and I ended up going the news route. And that led to, I graduate college, I get hired I was a weekend anchor in Mankato at KUIC for a year.
Oh, we have a Mankatoite over there. Wave nanny.
Love it.
She was our nanny.
There she
Old
is.
home
Our
week.
kids were little.
Yeah.
You're still, even though the kids are like 6 feet tall, you'll always be
Always the nanny.
Julie. Always the nanny. Yeah, Mankato. Mankato vibes.
Yeah, I had a year there, which was great. It was just cool to be like, oh my gosh, I have a job in TV. This is amazing. And then I worked for 2 years down in Austin, Minnesota at KARE.
Where all of my relatives live.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I went to an owl prowl there.
Brian, we are all
sorry.
connected to you.
What happens at an owl prowl?
Oh, wow. I think that was
They
at
prowl
another
for owls.
podcast here. You have to be very silent. They're a caravan of cars, and you're following the owl expert into the deep, dark woods and the pitch darkness. Nadav, my 16-year-old, he was there with us too.
Awesome.
And then you have to silently, and 3 out of 4 of us in our family have ADHD, so nothing is more challenging than standing silently waiting for owls
You
to
have
call back.
ADHD?
Yeah.
You have ADHD. You're just undiagnosed. That's the only difference between us. Kathleen thinks I'm funny.
That's really good.
Anyway, where were we? Owl prowl.
Owl prowling in
I
Austin.
really want to go on an owl prowl
It was the
now.
best.
Do
It
you?
was very strange.
Well, owls that's like wisdom, right? They're
Yes,
like wisdom.
That's right.
I mean, it was a great job.
Was it?
It was a great. It was awesome. I had a great time in Mankato, and then so 2 years in Austin.
Yep.
So I did 2 years there.
Spam.
That was yes. Wow, that was different smell every day.
It was.
Isn't that incredible?
Is
I
that
love
where
it.
Spam was born?
Yep.
Oh yeah.
That's the Spam Museum where I bought you a gift.
He got me a necklace with Spam on it
A little piece of Spam on
that I
there.
wear every
real one,
day.
Like actual spam.
It is. It's in a little container.
Except today. It didn't go with my outfit.
Yeah, that was an experience for sure. Like literally every day smelled. Like some days smelled good, kind of like a good
I like the smell.
You liked it?
I do.
It probably feels like
I love
nostalgic.
Spam though.
You do like Spam.
I love Spam. I don't just like it.
I actually don't know if I think I tried it once after living there. I was like, I need to try Spam, but I had never had it before I lived there.
I'm going to grill some for you and make you a sandwich. It's really good.
Spamage.
A Spamich.
A Spamich.
A Spamich.
A Spamich. That's more clever than what I
Fantastic.
said.
Look at that. So that job was when I started waking up at like 3 a.m. and going in and doing the news. I had to be like on the air at like 5 a.m. every day. And then at the age of 26, I get like my dream job and got hired at KARE 11
It's
here in the
incredible.
Twin Cities, which I literally never thought it would happen. And it happened at way sooner than I expected. And I literally was like pinching myself every single day that I had to walk in there, or that I got to walk in there.
So I'm going to go directly to KARE 11, but I do want to make a comment about why I keep going back to 6th grade.
Here we are
You know,
again.
you identified, I'm just going to make a comment. I won't ask you anymore. I want to make a comment that, you know, when our lives change due to some awareness of something going on for us, and for you it was at age 12 or so, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you have spent your entire life since kind of managing this. And that's why the family of origin assessment when we work with clients is really important to understand all of the factors, because Bryan, you really eloquently talk about it's still with you. Like that 12-year-old is still inside of you kind of managing the same stuff and it's never gone away.
Yeah.
So I am very curious, like if I were your therapist, which I'm not, just today, I will say that I would be curious about like the onset and what all of that meant and what you've developed for coping. And you, again, beautifully identify even maybe compensating for some of that in the work that you chose to do, but also hiding as a gay man about, you know, doing sports, et cetera. And you have some questions about whether or not that was the right choice for you. You know, Bryan, it's all about being authentic, and it's all being about, you know, being honest about what's going on for you and managing that and dealing with things the best you can. So I feel like you're still doing that. And I love this story because this is a lifelong process of staying well. So back to KARE 11, I'll get off of 6th grade for a second. Like I'm imagining you at age 12 is what I'm doing. Like it's
Totally.
Yeah. I mean, and I know that as you talk about it, you're back there. There I am talking about 6th grade again. So tell me about KARE 11. Tell us about, you know, what it was to work there with this anxiety. Did you let people know you had it?
Some people. You know, it's funny, actually, the first couple of years that I worked there, actually, it kind of went away, which was wild.
Wow.
I actually remember feeling like at one point, like, man, I'm doing really good.
Do you know why that was? You were feeling productive or right?
Yeah, I think it was just, I don't know if it was just so exciting. It really was like such an exciting thing.
Yeah.
It really could truly, I got to do I was doing all these really cool things. I was working with like coworkers that I used to like watch in college and like idolize. I mean, it was just this incredibly wild experience of being like, wow, I'm actually part of this now, which was really cool. And then, so for a long time, actually, I felt pretty good. And then I had an experience where I was doing traffic on the morning show one morning. And I was, not to get like too TV technical here, but I was like standing at the green screen doing my traffic report. And then I had to transition over to do an interview I was interviewing a guest who was in studio. And I was doing the traffic, and I just remember like heart beating out of my chest, super hit with this just like huge wave of anxiety, which was new for me in front of the camera. That never really used to happen to me in front of the camera.
Brutal.
I always actually kind of felt like the studio was the place where I could like escape the world, and I felt very on top of the world. And now all of a sudden it was like showing up right there in the studio on live television. And I just was heart beating out of my chest, got really short of breath, was like gasping for air as I was trying to transition over to like interview this poor person who's like waiting for this out of breath news anchor to come sit down next to them. And I got through it, but it rocked my world.
Because just like the lunch table, right? It's like, I didn't even know that this was possible. This was my safe space. And now
now it's here. And so as anybody who has experienced any sort of panic or huge wave of anxiety, a lot of times what happens, right, is it happens once and then it becomes this, oh no, worrying about when it's going to happen again. And so every time that I would step into the TV studio after that, it was always, I really hope I don't have a panic attack, and just being really, really overwhelmed.
Just like every day in junior high and high school.
And what's interesting is I've never made that connection before.
Oh.
Yeah, I've never really made that connection.
I'm glad you had it now.
Yeah, that was very similar to what was going on.
It feels like it. You almost identified it exactly the same way.
Yeah.
Like you had this worry that every day was going to turn out that way.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you might just continue on this journey and tell us what happened next.
Mm-hmm. It went on for years. I had some other instances where that would happen, where I would lose my breath on the air. I remember one time my co-anchor, I literally had to stop on live television and ask her to start reading for me. But I got, I would just do the best I could. Some days it would show up, other days it wouldn't, but there was always that worry in the back of my head of it might happen. And then made a decision eventually, a whole combination of a lot of things going on. I was also starting to really get a better understanding of how OCD was showing up in my life in some other ways, but essentially hit a point where I just was like, I don't think I can keep doing this anymore, stepping in front of the camera every single day. This just doesn't feel like it's good for my mental health. And so I went to my boss and just said, here's the deal. This is what I'm going through. She knew I had a really, really good and have a really good relationship with her. And she was wonderful in working with me and moved me to a position off air as a producer, and just to keep a job and yet also literally be able to just take a deep breath and just do some work on myself without the constant needing to step in front of the camera. And then decided to open up and really just share my story at KARE 11. I talked a little bit before about how the coolest thing about that job is the platform and the number of people that you get to reach. And I thought, I have this platform. I don't want to waste it. And I ended up opening up and sharing my story and talking about mental health and the things that I'd gone through with, panic attacks and a lot of more specifically with OCD. And that just launched this whole path that I've been on of advocacy work around mental health, and eventually leaving my job at KARE 11 and becoming a therapist.
It's incredible. It's just such an incredible story. And I remember when I was looking at your goodbye video for KARE 11, and it was with Jana Shortall.
With Jana, yeah.
And it was really powerful. If you guys haven't seen it, I think you could just look it up on YouTube or wherever. It was really beautiful. But they did show this moment where you were coughing. Like you were coughing to hide that you were so short of breath that you couldn't catch your breath.
So I used to always cover it up. I would just, my heart would start beating, and then I would get really short of breath, and then I would, just that whole cycle would kick in of, oh no, this is going to be really awful and embarrassing. And then I would always, I would just kind of cough, and I could usually do that a few times and get through it. But
I'm just thinking about how it goes from that, like the ultimate in hiding all of the symptoms and just like white knuckling it through, to I need to tell people, like, I can't keep going like this.
Yeah.
Was there any like a pivotal moment there where you decided, like, I can't?
Yeah, there was a weekend where I remember it was a really busy weekend. I had to work like a weekend shift, which wasn't super normal, but I had to fill in on doing reporting on the weekends. I was doing radio at the time. I did a season of radio with Minnesota United, the soccer team, which was awesome.
Yep.
So we had a match there. I think I was just really worn out. And I just remember it was like a Saturday, and I just called my mom crying. Was like literally on the floor, like crying to a friend of mine. And it was a moment. It was just another step in the journey of, okay, is not going very well. Like I think the biggest thing was I just needed to admit that I needed some support and I needed some help and I needed to make a change to move in a direction that is a little bit more healthy for me. And I think just much more in alignment with who I am too.
Do you miss being in front of the camera?
I don't. I will be honest. I do not miss doing news, like talking about hard news day in and day out, and the things that are going on got to be really challenging for me.
Yeah.
Yep.
What I do miss, I've always said I would go back in front of the camera on a regular basis if it was for the purposes of mental health or like that'd be like my dream at some point to have a show that's focused on mental health in front of the camera on a regular basis. Well, here we are.
We are.
There's a camera. There's a couple cameras going on there. Yeah. So like this, I think to answer your question, this kind of stuff in front of the camera, I love this. I always hate stepping into it because I'm always nervous.
Yes.
How are you feeling now?
I feel way better now.
Do you?
I do feel much better than when I stepped in here.
This is also when Doug asked me, we were like, I think having some, I don't know, cocktails and sushi, which is what our relationship used to look like in between River City Clinic and doing the podcast. Yep. And he presented the idea of let's put our heads together and make this amazing podcast about mental health. And I was like, absolutely not.
Yeah, it took 3 times.
It took 3 times because I was like, I'm not a public facing person. I was just mustache sweat just thinking about it. And it was the same thing. I'm like, but this is really important. And then at that 3rd time that I was about to say no,
Rob came.
Yeah, Rob came and helped me because it was sort of like, okay, so should I find someone else? And I was like, no, that spot's mine. It's gotta be me. And then I realized like this was
manipulation.
Enough of a reason. Blackmail, manipulation.
I'll find someone else, Talia.
No
I hear
problem.
Bryan
I didn't
Piatt's
want you
available.
anyway. This is perfect. We were looking for a 3rd.
How long have you been doing this podcast now?
2 years going on 200.
Is it been 2 years?
It's not 2 years.
2 years. A year and a half.
It's like my podcast. We said I've been doing it for 5.
300 to
so-
500 years.
It's like 10 years.
It's great. I love it.
Yeah, I know. That'll give you a
settled
lot more
on 42.
credibility.
Yeah,
I
42.
want to comment on what you just said, though, Bryan. When you walked in today, you and I talked a lot about our anxiety, like whether I felt anxious, which I don't generally anymore for this. But you were talking about some anxiety coming in, and I said, it will go away. Yeah. And I knew it would.
Yeah.
Is it really gone away?
Totally. It absolutely. I mean, and then it goes away until I start thinking about it, and then it starts coming back.
So let's go back to 6th grade.
Yeah, so let's go back to 6th grade.
I'm joking.
But I think, and I talk about this all the time with clients and just on like the platforms that I find myself on. I think, this idea of just showing up is 90% of the battle for me. It's just show up. And our mind is always going to come up with a reason for why we shouldn't, or how things might go wrong, or things might be bad, or it feels like it's going to be too hard. But what I have found over and over again in my life to be true is that if I have the courage to step in and show up with all that stuff along for the ride, it's more often than not as bad as my brain was telling me it was going to be.
I feel like that's such an important message.
I was just going to say.
You can't be brave unless you're afraid, right? You can't, you've got to, and I'm thinking about how it was probably for your years at KARE 11, it was probably somewhere in the back of your head, maybe the scariest thing ever to admit what was going on for you. And I also picture that you were terrified about what people would say or what the responses would be.
Yeah.
How were you surprised by how people responded to you?
Yeah. I mean, it was incredible, the response, the number of people. It was a lesson in vulnerability. We talk all the time about vulnerability. When you have the courage to be vulnerable, I'm wholeheartedly convinced that it opens up a portal for other people to do the same in return. And I got to see that firsthand through that experience of I shared something with our viewers and with coworkers and things like that. And the number of messages that I got in return of people saying, oh my gosh, me too. You know, I've never really shared this before. This is what I'm going through. Coworkers coming up to me and sharing things with me that I never knew before. It was wild and beautiful. And I'm so grateful for the response that I had.
And sometimes we underestimate other people's ability to show up for us.
Yes.
And that's a beautiful lesson.
And I think it's hard. I think the biggest thing that's hard, what's hardest for me as somebody who always wants to like be pulled together, or like that's a very common theme for me in my life. I need to be pulled together and I need to be the one that's on. Mm-hmm. To allow yourself to be held by other people and be supported by other people still to this day is really challenging for me. Yeah. And is really, really hard. And I think that's, you know, I think that flip side of vulnerability too is allowing yourself to be supported can be really hard.
It can be.
I think one of the things, Talia, that you mentioned at the beginning of today is that what's going on with, you know, post-COVID and the pandemic, the George Floyd murder, the political divisiveness, the fucking crazy political divisiveness we have in circumstances, which going back to like covering the news, I can't even imagine trying to cover the news in an objective way at this point. That felon is on the ballot, no offense to anybody, is crazy to me. So I look at this and I think there's so many stressors people are going through, and mental health is a lifelong process for all of us. You know, I'm a bit older than you and I'm still like figuring things out about myself, and it's really fantastic. Yeah. Like, but it's kind of surprising. I'm like, I think I know everything and then I don't. Totally. And it's really kind of fascinating. And being a therapist means that you're always on, right? Yeah. And so there's also that, and I'm kind of curious how you're managing that as a clinician. Like, when you don't feel like showing up, or you don't know who's coming into your office and you have a new intake and you're not sure what to expect, or somebody comes in with something entirely surprising. I'm curious about that for you. Or maybe
even if something's like triggering your own stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you two know way more than I do. Like there's that pressure I've found as a new therapist of, okay, I'm in the therapist chair. I need to have all the answers for these people who are coming in.
Yes.
You know, and I don't want them to be disappointed, and I don't want them to like regret working with me. And like, there's just all that stuff that starts to happen internally. And so I still feel that most days when I step into this work. I feel this sense of resistance of like, oh no, this is really like a scary space. And yet, just like I showed up here today, you know, I just have to step in. Yep. And I would say basically every day, most days I leave there feeling like, wow, I'm so glad I did. And I'm like, truly, it is such an honor to do this work. And I feel energized by it in a way that I haven't felt energized by my work in a long time. Oh, so again, I think there's still that resistance, right? And I always just feel so strongly about talking about that, because I think we're fed this narrative that life is just supposed to be easy. And if you're doing the right thing, life is going to be easy. And I think there is truth to like finding those things that feel natural and where there's some flow. Like those are great moments, but sometimes those only last like 30 seconds. Right. You know, and a lot of life is learning how to step into uncomfortable things and showing up before we're ready.
You know what's so interesting? You picked two careers that are ridiculously exposing and challenging. Yeah. Like being in front of a camera and being public and having people be able to scrutinize you, et cetera, how you look, what you say, all those sorts of things, I imagine. I've only gotten one negative YouTube review of our podcast.
Don't read the comments.
I thought it was a fun comment. I wish it had stayed on, but YouTube took it off. You know, and so the other thing is being a therapist, though. It's a very vulnerable place. I remember starting and just feeling very green and very anxious and always wanting to be prepared. And then by the time I got to 8 to 10 people a day, I'm like, I got this. I know exactly what I'm doing. You were too tired
to worry about those things.
I was too tired. You know, my dear friend Kelly over there, who went to graduate school with me and also was on the news this morning about her new book.
She was.
Kelly Grosslugs, grief expert. We're going to have her as our live guest very soon. So you'll want to not miss that woman in red. But one of our amazing professors said, all you need to do is listen and try to understand as a therapist. It was the most beautiful thing he said to me, because we were doing these rehearsals of videos, and I remember being in my head all the time and being like asking questions, right?
Well, and I feel like everyone has the fraud complex when they're stepping into a brand new career, especially when we're green. But I think it's just...
Did you say frog?
Frog complex. When we're green.
Oh, I get the frog complex. I'm like,
I said fraud.
Okay. I thought you said
the frog works. That actually works.
Frog complex.
Yeah.
But I also feel like 80% of the magical therapeutic, like what actually helps create change, is being a compassionate witness. That might be the one space in people's lives where they have someone sitting with them, no agenda other than their own wellness. And even just to be one step ahead is far enough.
Yeah. And just, I think it's, I think back to a lot of the therapists that I've worked with in my life, and definitely tools that I've learned from them and skills that I've learned from them. But I think at the end of the day, what has been the most powerful therapy that I've received in my life is exactly what you're talking about. It's just a safe space to be seen and witnessed. And I have to keep reminding myself of that every single day. And when I forget it, I'll just keep calling the two of you.
And absolutely. Be like, remind me again about the frog complex.
I like frog much better than frog.
Me too. I think we've
green. You pulled that together.
Green.
We're green. Like your glasses.
There's merch. A future merch
there
about
is.
This here.
So Bryan, of course, the We're Not Fine podcast is about the connection between mental health and relationships.
Yeah.
So you've talked about some relationships, the people you trusted at KARE 11, maybe your therapist, kind of figuring this out within your family of origin. But I'm kind of curious in your social life now with friends, with boyfriends, with
we don't out anyone at this podcast.
We don't. With dating, space. With all of these things, like how does anxiety show up? How do you manage it? How do you talk about it?
Yeah.
You talk about it on the first date?
I try not to.
Do you really?
Date. That might be a little intimidating, right? Just talk about it. Maybe it would be the best date ever.
It'd be the best date for me ever.
That's true,
I have
actually.
pretty
That's
big
true.
OCD.
That's true.
I've had a lot of surprises.
Well, and that's one thing that, and when we were talking, Talia, about the overlap with relationships in my work, it's another way that OCD manifests for some people in their life, including myself, is the fixation on relationships. And I feel very passionate about talking about this one because this can be really, really, really tough for a lot of people to maneuver. But for some people living with OCD, there can be a lot of tendencies around obsessing and ruminating around this idea of the rightness of relationships, the wrongness of relationships, needing to figure out if they're the one all the time, and constantly checking in on feelings around relationships. Yep. That it's kind of a hard thing to describe until you're actually in it, but that dating and being in relationships for people who live with OCD, for some people, is really challenging. Yeah. It's really, really challenging. And it requires a lot of deep work, and it requires one moment at a time mentality and taking it one day at a time. But yeah, that relationship OCD piece is one of the many ways that, again, OCD can manifest for people. I will
say it blew my mind. And I've been doing this for 20 years and I'd never even thought about relationship OCD or how it can show up in relationship. And I thought of at least, when you were talking about that, I thought of at least 6 people that I'm working with that really felt like, oh my gosh, because it's, how do I feel? Do I like them enough? Do I like them enough to stay with them? But they did that one thing, so maybe it's a sign.
And then there's attachment styles in all of that as well.
It gets all mixed in there too.
It
gets really mixed in. Absolutely disorganized.
Well, and we live we live in a society that's just steeped with, I think, a lot of very unhealthy messaging around relationships. Sure. This idea of, you gotta be on this quest for your soulmate 24/7. You got to find the one. If it feels uncomfortable, you better get out of there. It's just, and obviously there's exceptions around that, around things like abuse and things like that. That becomes a different conversation. But it is a theme that actually, at the time when I had that first panic attack, I've never really talked about this publicly, but apparently you've made me feel safe to talk about it. When I had that first panic attack on KARE 11, I was kind of in a relationship situation that had a really, really activated relationship OCD for me. And I didn't really understand what was going on, but I was consumed with just this constant if I'm not with the right person, I'm going to feel off, and then my whole world's going to crumble, and I'm like out of alignment with the universe if I'm not with the right person. And like, these are the places that you go in your brain around this.
Of course. Yeah.
And it just cycles you into this intense amount of anxiety. And so, yeah. And I still, I mean, this is still stuff that I maneuver every single day, but it's just so, I just feel so passionate about talking about it, because I know there's a lot of people out there maneuvering similar things and doing it silently.
Bryan, thank you so much for sharing something you haven't shared publicly.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you're comfortable sharing what the outcome of that relationship OCD experience was.
Well, how it's played out for me a lot in the past has been this dynamic of being in a relationship felt so hard and overwhelming and just like too much for my system to handle. And so then I would always end relationships because it felt too hard, or it wasn't, maybe it was always like this feeling of anxiety is a sign from the universe that I'm with the wrong person.
Yeah.
And so then it would be, I'm going to end the relationship. And then a lot of the anxiety would go away. But then there would be an immense amount of grief and a sense of loss and a sense of, oh my gosh, like what if, I'm desperately missing this person. And then, okay, I'm going to get back in the relationship now that the anxiety has gone away. But then you get into the relationship and now the anxiety is there again. And so now I got to end it again. So it's like this push and pull dynamic that you get in that is torture.
I mean, I think that's a pretty common experience, not just with anxiety and OCD, but with attachment, depression, a lot of other disorders. There's this experience. I mean, I've worked with a lot of people that will come in after a breakup, or they break up because there's such pain, such internal pain, and they do all their healing in a vacuum.
Yeah.
When they're not in a relationship. And then the second they get back into a relationship, that part never healed.
Yeah.
And so all of it comes flooding back because they never did the work while they were loving actively. And that can be a real problem for people.
Yeah. And I think that understanding, right, that healing happens in relationship.
Yes. And when people will always say like, I'm not ready to be in a relationship right now, I'm still working on myself. I'm like, that's bullshit. You have to work on yourself while in relationships to grow in the same direction with another human, because if then you're completely perfected and healed, but you could only be alone, that's pretty lonely too.
Yeah. And I really do think, I think learning how to be in relationship with others is like the deepest work of a lifetime. I think it really it activates, it activates everything at the deepest level. And I think if we're not, I can only speak for myself, right? If I'm not able to sit with my own stuff,
that's right.
How am I ever going to be able to sit with somebody else in moments and be able to, actually get to a point where I can truly work on the relationship if I'm just flooded with my own stuff all the time?
As a partner, as a therapist.
Which kind of brings up the pattern that you've just identified even today, where you realize that what happened at KARE 11 was the minute you had an experience that was not comfortable, you worried every day that it would recur. Mm-hmm. You did the same post 6th grade, right? So I'm curious, Bryan, like now that you know what you know, and I realize that this is always an ongoing process, if it happened again, if you found yourself in a situation as a therapist where you were going in every day and worrying that you were going to be breathless and needing to take that deep breath that you just did, what would you do differently? Do you know?
Well, I know I have a lot more tools in the toolkit now.
And us.
That I'm just going to call you.
Yes, you can. The end.
The end. You're just going to do my sessions for me. That's what we're going to do.
I'm booked.
You don't need us. Yeah. You're fresh. No. We're tired and sad.
That's not true. That's not true.
I'm booked.
I am so grateful that I have more tools now in the toolkit, like things that I know that I lean into every single day now to not take it away, not take the anxiety away or make all the doubt go away, but it at least puts me in a place now where I can show up for my life and like ride the waves of what's coming up in a different way.
And you know what it is.
Yeah. And I think
that's
the naming
powerful.
it, right? Just the naming it of like, okay, this is what's going on, you know?
Yeah.
Even though there's this thing with OCD that starts to happen where you start doubting whether or not you actually have OCD, which is a cruel little trick that OCD likes to play.
Please talk more about that if you can.
Well, it's, you know, OCD is it's often referred to as the doubting disorder.
Yes.
You know, it's like this really, really like a really hard time with like just sitting with any kind of doubt or uncertainty. And so I've had the experience, I know a lot of other people have, of you get diagnosed with OCD and you kind of start doing the work on it and you start making progress, and then your brain starts going, well, maybe you don't actually have OCD, and maybe this is actually something much deeper or something different going on. And so then that in and of itself becomes like
a brain
whole
tumor.
Yeah.
It's cruel.
Yep.
It's just everywhere you turn, OCD is going to show up and throw something else at you.
Well, and there's nothing scarier than doubt without trusting your innate ability to answer your own doubt or reassure yourself that it's going to be okay. And you said something really powerful just about no longer ignoring, escaping, pushing it away, which makes, I mean, the next question we wanted to ask was about your healing journey. And it sounds like that was about integrating OCD and anxiety and panic as a part of your tapestry rather than just ignoring, denying.
Yeah, I think it's like this recognition that I now don't, I try not to go into every single day saying things to myself like, oh, I hope it doesn't show up today. It's more of, I know it's going to show up today, and I'm going to do my best to invite it along for the ride and create space for it and try to get a little bit more anchored in how I'm showing up, like my actions while I'm experiencing those things.
Yep.
So I think that's been a foundational shift for me, because I was spending a long time just, you know, I need to do everything I can to like feel good, and I can't show up, and when it would show up, it would send me into a spiral. And now it's kind of more of a place of, it sucks when it shows up. I hate when it shows up, but I know what it is. Like you said, I can kind of name it.
Yep.
And I can do my best to just say, okay, to be expected. It's here. I'm going to, you know, put it on my bus, and we're going to keep driving in the direction
put it
of
on your bus.
It's like my favorite metaphor
Come
ever.
along for the ride.
I talk about it all the time. I know Kelly knows that.
I love it.
Like I literally envision, it's like I'm in the driver's seat of my bus every single day, and all day long there are passengers getting on that bus in the form of thoughts, in the form of emotions, in the form of sensations in my body, doubt, uncertainty, whatever it is. And instead of trying to get those passengers off the bus, it's more of, I'm going to invite them on, but they don't get to sit in the driver's seat. They get to take a seat in the back.
That's nice. Yep.
And I get to decide. I have my hands on the steering wheel, and I'm deciding where I'm going with that bus, you know. And today it was, I steered the bus here to this podcast, even though there was the fear and the doubt and all that stuff showing up. It was like, I'm just going to steer it there, and I'm going to sit here and allow that stuff to be part of the process, as uncomfortable as that can be sometimes.
It's beautiful. And there was a book, I forget what the name of the book was, but it was about, I think, creative, like performance anxiety. It was like Elizabeth Gilbert, and also talking about that anxiety, you're more than welcome to come along for the ride, but there's no way you can get behind the wheel. You're not invited to drive the bus.
Totally. Yeah, because that's when we get in trouble. That's when we get in trouble, right? Is when we start turning around and taking our hands off the wheel and shouting at the passengers and all that. That's when we start to really go we start making decisions based on those passengers.
Well, and especially if the passenger is this neural pathway that the red flags are always screaming, danger, fight or flight, you're going to die, something horrible is going to happen.
Yeah.
It's really also, I can't imagine how hard it is to just be like, oh, I still hear you screaming.
Yeah.
But
So I might be the driver, though, that turns around and say, shut the fuck up.
You would.
I would.
You would.
To the frog in particular.
To the frog.
That gets on.
Which brings us to the frog complex, which brings us to like, you've experienced, you've suffered you've healed or healing. We're never healed.
That's,
Onward and upward. But are there any daily practices that you find have really changed your world in managing?
I mean, there's a lot of things that I lean on. You know, there's obviously the going to therapy. I take medication. I try to move my body as best I can, you know, really trying to connect to my body in many different ways. I was really leaned into like my yoga practice for a really long time. A couple things that I don't do them from the standpoint of, oh, they like take my OCD away or something like that, but they help me connect to my body. Is breath work has been deeply, deeply powerful for me because I think the mechanism of anxiety and OCD is this, like, I'm going to fly up into my brain and try to live up there all the time. Yep. And I've found the breath is this beautiful tool that doesn't cost us a thing. And it's with us at all times, that helps me just get a little bit more connected to my heart, a little bit more connected to my body. Even if I only hang out there for literally 10 seconds, it at least is a reminder of there's a deeper part of myself that lives within me that I don't always have access to when I'm stuck up in my brain.
That's
Bryan,
beautiful.
can you talk specifically about what breath work you do?
Yeah.
Like what strategy?
Yeah. So there's, you know, I teach a lot of, so like alternate nostril breath is a technique that I lean into a lot. I'll literally do that for like 3 minutes before I see clients or do something that I know is going to be overwhelming. Yep. I did some training through a guy out in New Mexico, actually over COVID, much deeper form of breath work where you're doing like a 3-part breath, like into the belly, into the chest, release on a repeat for like 20 to 30 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And without passing out.
I was just thinking, it feels like you're are you lightheaded? Right? Are you?
Oh, all that stuff comes up. But it is, I'm not kidding you. For me, the most powerful tool that I have ever come across to date to feel my emotions and not just intellectualize my emotions.
Because it just gets you.
It gets you like into this deeper part of yourself where you can like, I don't know, like shift energy in your body in a way that I had never experienced before.
That's really lovely.
That's
so that's been great. I do like a lot of like cold plunging that helps me, like another practice of like just getting into my body and connected to my body. So there's so many different things.
But it's sensory.
Yeah. It's like more somatic, right? Like how do I connect to my body? And yet all the while doing the cognitive work of creating space for thoughts, creating space for emotions, like not taking the bait of intrusive thoughts when they show up and not ruminating constantly about that, and kind of learning the tools of how to maneuver my brain while doing a lot of those other practices.
You know, what's so striking about what you're talking about in terms of how you manage this every day? It just feels really risk-taking and courageous, and like you're taking the bull by the horns. Like, Bryan, when you talk about these daily things, you're not helpless. You're not a victim to any of this stuff. You're really deciding, I'm going to do something. Cold plunges, can't imagine.
Yeah,
have you ever done one?
Plus, materials. I don't swim, so I would drown. I have not.
Well, they're not deep, so we'd make sure you didn't drown.
Okay, well, you make sure I don't. Like, put a rope on me and then pull me.
As my husband and son will tell you, that even if it's like 80-degree water, it will take me 45 minutes to inch my way into it.
You got to plunge.
It's really dramatic.
That's why I'm liking how you talk about this, because it just feels like
just dive
do
in.
it. It's like the Nike.
It's literally a daily. It's a daily commitment to getting uncomfortable is what it is.
Horrible.
Sucks every time I do it. I hate, I never go into.
The buildup would not be fun.
I never go into a cold plunge going like, I cannot wait to cold plunge today.
But I bet you say, I can't wait till it's over, and I feel so proud of myself.
But it's shifting a relationship with our things that are outside of our comfort zone.
And
so if I can
choosing it.
Yeah. Like if I can get into that cold water, then later on when I start to feel anxiety come up in my body, it carries over to that, I find. It's like, oh, I've been in an uncomfortable space already today. I've kind of developed that neural pathway, and that I've found that really translates to emotions as well.
Bryan, first of all, this is so beautiful and valuable. And we've got one more question before we open it up to audience questions, so you guys can start thinking about if anyone has anything to ask.
Are we going back to 6th grade?
I'm not done yet.
I am. I
We
know.
have
I was
one
going
more
to say,
question?
I always wrap it up, and Doug's like, but back to 6th grade.
Yeah, back to 6th grade.
Let's have another 45
we'll go to
minutes.
But you know
7th.
why I'm going there.
I know.
The
But Doug-
origin of all of this is so powerful to
I
me.
am. I'm bringing it back for you.
Thank you
This
so
one's
much.
for Doug.
For Doug. This is for Doug.
So if little...
The polar plunge.
The polar
I want to do one with you. I really want to.
I will do it with you. You have to put a rope on me.
If a little scared and confused you were to come into your therapy office right now and sit on your couch, how would you work with him and what would you tell him?
I know I would give him language to describe what he's going through.
Beautiful. Yeah.
I know that would be a huge piece, would be just validating what he's going through and letting him know that he's not losing his mind.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that would honestly be one of the biggest pieces, would just be the language and then not normalizing, but validating, right? Like just validating the experience that he's having. And I would want to let him know that he's no better than or worse than any other person on the planet. Like,
Could you imagine if you would have had a Bryan when you were in 6th grade?
would have been, yeah, that would have been nice. that would have been really special to have that experience. Not of obviously me, but working with somebody who could have validated that for sure. But yeah.
I was going to say, Bryan, one of the things that is powerful sometimes also going back to that scenario is self-disclosure, which as therapists is a really tricky thing to do sometimes, but you have an amazing story to tell people that you work with as well and are clearly a success story.
Well, thank you. And then it's always kind of that delicate balance, of finding those
100%.
moments to really share. But I think especially early on in my career as a therapist, it's probably what I have to offer the most. Sometimes it's just that, like, hey, I know what this feels like. And I've been there in my own way.
It's really powerful.
The compassionate
it,
witness,
right?
but also that you've experienced it gives you street cred.
Yeah.
I honestly could keep going and
I
going
know.
and going on this conversation. It's really a pleasure.
Thank you to both of you for having this. Thank you so much.
Such
But of
a
course,
pleasure.
Thank you all for coming.
So, does anybody have questions for Bryan?
And
Or
do
any
we-
of us.
Or Doug.
Do we have a microphone? Where's that's the microphone? Oh, so they could just ask from their seat? Oh, Mom,
Stand under the
are you
light.
the first question asker? No, you got to stand up.
No, that's okay.
Then you project.
Is there, has ever anybody been cured of this disorder?
Cured?
Cured. What, of OCD?
Cured, we know what I mean. Not
Yeah.
cured. Or you just have to accept it and get tools.
A beautiful question.
Deal
is.
with it. And just like you deal with the chronic disease.
Yeah. So,
Question.
yeah, such a good question. So the research that I'm aware of is that there's no known cure for OCD, and there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of incredible treatments and modalities out there that are really, really helpful, and people live beautiful, productive, wonderful lives while living with OCD.
100%.
So I try personally, it's just kind of how I look at it. I try not to approach the work from this place of like, we're going to cure this and you're never going to have an intrusive thought again that causes anxiety. It's more from a place of, we can't control when somebody necessarily has an intrusive thought, but what we can control is how they respond to it. And when people start responding to it differently, their life starts to change in a really beautiful way. So I think, again, can only speak for myself. I'm really at this place where I just accept that this is kind of how my brain works, but I just learn how to work with my brain. And I think the more that we do that, our life really starts to open
That's
up.
amazing.
Yeah.
I'll also comment that, the symptoms do diminish significantly. I've had a client who was repeatedly hospitalized due to intrusive thoughts of hurting his children. And once I identified that it was OCD, we got him on some medication that kind of evened out some of that stuff. He now has gone to college. He's now a therapist as well.
after 25 years probably of seeing him, and he's maintaining beautifully. He no longer is debilitated. Like, these were debilitating moments and episodes for him. Those do not occur. They're not even close.
Well, I was just quick little thing I was going to add too is I think it's really important that if you're starting to sense that OCD might be what you're struggling with, really, really important to work with a therapist who actually works with OCD, because getting the right treatment for OCD is really, really important. And a kind of a little follow-up question that I would always ask a therapist is make sure that they have at least some understanding of a modality called exposure and response prevention. That's really considered the gold standard treatment, evidence-based treatment for OCD. So that's one thing I always say, like, make sure at least your therapist has kind of an understanding of that, and that's at least on their radar, because that's going to probably tell you at least that they have some experience working with it.
I appreciate that, Bryan. I think that's very true. I think one of the things that people oftentimes experience, these are very scary thoughts.
Totally.
Whether it's contamination, whether it's fear of hurting somebody, whether you think you've ran over a rock and you thought it was a person. These are really intrusive things that are really harmful. And so talking to somebody who can identify this as what it is, going back to your comment about naming it and calling it what it is. But that's the starting gate. It gets much easier once you identify. And Bryan's a great example of that, by the way, right? Like making life work.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Great question.
Have there been any studies to indicate that there's a hereditary component to OCD?
Great question.
Beautiful question. I'm happy to go, but
I was going to say, I don't know, but I'm assuming because there's a wiring, right? That's just like usually there's a family history of anxiety, probably.
Yeah. My understanding, and again, I always encourage people to kind of look up the research too on their own, but is that having a family member who struggles with OCD, I think definitely increases like the likelihood of somebody like a child of theirs potentially struggling with OCD. I think it's a real combination of genetics, like a hereditary potential thing going on mixed with environmental. So like how I kind of look at it in my own life is that I think I was more predisposed to this just through, kind of my genetic makeup or whatever you want to call it, hereditary. And then I think it was like that experience in middle school really just like activated it. And that's kind of what really, brought it really to the surface. So that's what I see a lot with people is that there's kind of a combination of both.
So stress can induce some of this. So there can be a genetic factor, just as you described, like a predisposition, but it can be stress induced as well. Like, we live in a very strange world right now. So there doesn't necessarily have to be that genetic component is my research and understanding, but there can be. And that predisposition, talking about all those factors, Bryan, for you that might have contributed to that incident in 6th grade, which I'm going to go back to over and over and over. Even while we're doing the plunge, I'm going to bring it.
You're going to be like, so 6th grade. It'll keep you distracted from the cold.
I'm in the water. So 6th grade, tell me more.
I mean, there is something about panic attacks, though, which can sometimes for people come out of nowhere. Maybe there is a family history also of anxiety or panic, or maybe not. Wrong place, wrong time. But then people start to panic about panic. And then it becomes panic disorder, because once you've had a panic attack, which people often feel like they're going to die or their heart's going to explode or they're going to pass out or something horribly or they're having a heart attack that they're going to die.
Like you're going to die.
And then you start to worry that that's going to happen to you. What if it happens when I'm driving? What if it happens when I'm going on a date? What if it happens at school, at work? And then sometimes that panic disorder can even become agoraphobia, because people are so terrified to be in public if that should happen. So they should probably just stay home.
Well, and Bryan, that's what you were saying. You were so afraid of it happening again and again.
It's terrifying.
Right? And so going to panic as well, I think, so I had my own panic attack maybe 15 years ago for the first time. It was in the middle of the night. And I remember thinking as a therapist, like, I know what this is. And so I walked around and I'm like, I know what the fuck this is. And I couldn't make it go away. And I'm like, but I know what to do as well. And it was a fascinating experience. And then I had one more, but that was it. And it was a lot of stress going on. I was leaving a relationship and I was starting a new one.
Bryan, I have a child who struggles or suffers from OCD, and she has, the compulsions are physical, right? So when she was little, it was washing hands, please take my temperature, like to show her that she wasn't sick. Her main thing was contamination when she was little, and it's morphed into all sorts of different flavors over time. But what struck me when you were talking is it seemed like a lot of yours was in your mind. Like I know she was having those intrusive thoughts and stuff, but then I was able to eventually, figure it out. It maybe took me longer than it should have, but like because I would see the hand washing, or I would see the excessive cleansing, or all of those things. I'm sick. No, you're not sick. I'm nauseous. All of that. But for those around you, it almost sounds like you were able to kind of keep that hidden. But then that's what brought me to exposure and response prevention. Because you're like, how do you do exposure?
Great question. It's a great question.
When it's kind of your those thoughts that you're really. I didn't hear you talk about compulsions. I didn't hear you talk about physical compulsions.
Sure.
More the checking and that.
Yep. So the compulsions, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful question. So the compulsions generally with more of those mental compulsions are things like ruminating, mentally checking, just any kind of attempt to like mentally excessively figure out or get to the bottom of, I guess is always kind of how it's always how it felt like for me. Like I need to solve this thing going on in my head fully before I can move on. So like the avoidance, the rumination, the mental checking, sometimes people will be doing a lot of things like praying or counting to certain numbers in their head, or like thought neutralization is really, really common with OCD too. So if somebody has a thought like, I'm a bad person, they might be like constantly, no, I'm a good person, saying things like that in their head. And you're spot on that it's like an invisible thing that is really, really hard, number one, for people around like a child to notice. And then number two, it's oftentimes the person that's struggling themselves actually has no idea that what they're going through is OCD. There's actually a statistic out there that somewhere like, I always forget the exact number. It's between 14 and 17 years on average from onset of first symptoms. Usually takes somebody on average 14 to 17 years to get properly diagnosed with OCD.
Wow.
Because of how misunderstood it is and how many people are engaging in compulsive activity that they don't even really understand our compulsions.
Well, friends, before we wrap, I want Bryan, plug anything. What do you have going on? Where can people find you?
Yeah, so we have, I was going to say, you can find me in the cold plunge with Doug. You're welcome to if you want to.
I'll clap for you. I'm out.
We'll talk about 6th grade.
Yeah, we'll go back to 6th grade. So where can you find me? I'm on Instagram. So you can find me at Bryan Piatt. It's Bryan with a Y and then Piatt. Although I fantasize daily about never going on social media ever again. So we'll see how long I'm on there. And then I also have a podcast.
I'll DM you tonight, by the way.
I might not be there, So I also have a podcast, Take What Serves, Leave the Rest is the podcast. And then my practice, I work at a small private practice in Bloomington called State of Mind Therapy. We focus primarily on OCD and anxiety treatment. So if there's anybody who's interested in looking for a therapist when it comes to OCD and anxiety, I would be happy to talk to anybody.
1 million people to you.
I love it.
And we are also on social media, but we're bad at it. But it's douglasljensen with an EN and Dr. Talia Jackson and We're Not Fine Pod. And we also have TikTok, I'm pretty sure now. We're
I think
YouTube.
So.
This will be on YouTube. This is going to drop Tuesday, day after tomorrow.
Cool.
The 4th of June.
Yeah.
And we're notfine.com. It's our one-stop shop. You can find anything there that you're looking for about us. And today is the day that we are offering merch for the first time ever. So on your way out, you can peruse. But don't forget to walk around and look at Nick's glorious works of art.
Absolutely. And just a reminder that in a month we're doing the same thing. We're going to confirm our time with Nick, but
July 14th.
We're doing postpartum depression. We have a couple talking about it.
That's
really important
August
topic.
11th.
Oh, is that August?
July 14th is catastrophic loss and finding yourself after.
Well,
Real uplifting.
our grief expert is horrified.
Yeah. Kelly will be here.
And then Kelly will be after that. We're going to find a date.
And also, the upcomings, we have a couple things posted around. So our next two, July 14th, August 11th, save the date.
Thank you all.
Seriously, we love you guys. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, everybody.